These are difficult moral questions. Is it ever morally permissible for a criminal, even the worst of criminals, to be punished with the death penalty? If it is morally permissible for our government, whether it's the state or federal government, to kill another person, if that's permissible, then why? What are the reasons for that? On the other hand, if putting a criminal to death is not morally permissible, again, what are the reasons for that? We need to understand what are the reasons for the moral permissibility or wrongness of the death penalty. One reason why this is important, why this moral issue is important, is because the United States is one of the few Western developed nations that still retains the death penalty. There's 140 countries worldwide that have abolished the death penalty. They no longer practice or use the death penalty as a punishment for criminals. 58 countries still retain the death penalty and continue to practice and employ it. We are one of those 58. And in fact, we are one of the top countries when it comes to the number of people put to death. And in terms of the other countries that we are in company with, we are in company with China, Iraq, and Iran, just to name a few. Again, we're one of the few Western developed nations to continue to retain the death penalty. Is that right of us as the United States or as the state of Colorado? Should we retain the death penalty or should we abolish it? 32 out of the 50 states in the United States are retentionist. They retain the death penalty. 18 states have abolished the death penalty. Which states are correct, right? If a murderer commits a crime in Texas, for instance, they could get the death penalty. It might be determined that that criminal deserves the death penalty. However, if a different criminal commits the same exact crime in another state that does not have the death penalty, then it will automatically be deemed that they do not deserve the death penalty. They deserve something lesser, which would be, in this case, presumably prison time without parole. But if the crimes are exactly the same, shouldn't the punishments be exactly the same? In other words, don't those criminals deserve the same punishment if they committed the same crime? And yet, depending on what state you live in, will determine what you deserve, the death penalty or perhaps life in prison. That seems a little odd, right? So as I've been alluding to, there are two general positions one could take on this issue. You could be a retentionist, along with our author Ernest Vendenhog. Again, if you are a retentionist, you believe that we ought to retain the death penalty. We ought to continue to practice the death penalty because the death penalty is morally permissible, or perhaps even stronger, it's morally required of us to practice the death penalty. On the other hand, you might be an abolitionist. You might believe that the death penalty ought to be abolished. And in that case, you would be saying that no criminal, no matter how heinous, no matter how terrible the crime, deserves to be killed themselves. The government, whether it's state or the federal government, ought not be killing criminals. So those are the two general positions you might take on this issue, one of the two, right? So let's now get into Stephen Nathanson's argument. He is the representative of the abolitionist position, and let's see some of his reasoning for why he believes that the death penalty ought not be practiced in our society.